Hello everybody, this is Christian, and in this video I will show you a few sidelines for the hyper-accelerated dragon if your opponent tries to surprise you in this opening. The first sideline I will show you I call the queen takes d4 line, and this goes like this: pawn to a4, c5, knight to f3, g6, d4, c takes d4. And now the logical move knight takes d4 is a standard move, but perhaps your opponent wanna surprise you, queen takes d4. And that's the move we wanna look for. The queen is threatening the rook here, but this is a blunder because you can simply play knight to f6. And now the most logical move, and by far the most played move here, is pawn to e5. This looks really threatening, but this is a blunder because after the following sequence, knight to c6, queen has two correct squares, which she gonna goes for, and also a very bad square. And the bad square is queen to d1. This is a big blunder because white loses a pawn immediately. After knight takes e5, you go for queen check and take this knight here, and black is just a pawn up. So white cannot play queen to d1, and after queen to f4, for example, you simply play knight to d5. This is the best square for the knight in this opening. And for example, queen to c4, knight here, queen has to retreat like this. Then you go bishop here and play immediately d5. This is not really hard for black to play, so that's the reason why we go not for this line. Instead, I think the best move for white to follow is queen to a4. This is also the most often played move, of course, and I think the best move. And that's the reason why I will show you a correct game from both sides, how you can manage this if you have the black pieces. Let's start with queen to a4. After queen to a4, at first you have to remove the knight on f6, so knight to d5. And now we have a really often played move here, this is bishop to b5. Then you can play immediately a6, kick the bishop away, bishop e2. And now the best one is to develop your pieces, knight on g7. Then white has to protect this pawn. I will show you that later. Then at first white should castle on the king side, and black cannot capture this pawn because of a threat, and I will show you that. For example, knight takes e5, bishop takes, and the queen has this double attack here. This is a very small trap for white, but you have to know this. So after castle on the king side, you should also castle on the king side. And now I think the best move for white is to play queen to h4. But at first we will show for a more bad move for white. And this is a really natural move, but it is not really good. And this is pawn to c4. But this is losing a pawn here, because after knight to c7, what should white do? For example, try to protect the pawn on e5. But after the move knight to e6, attacking this bishop has to retreat, and then we play the move d6. And now e takes d6 is a big blunder because the bishop can take this pawn and later on the rook. This is a big mistake. So you cannot take it. For example, rook to d1 and then queen to b6. And now it is not really clear how white can continue. For example, queen to a3, defending this pawn, but then he's losing a pawn. And I think the rest of the game you should manage with an advantage for black. Okay, now I will show you how you can manage later on the queen to h4 move. After queen to h4, I will show you a really tough defense for black. You can remain this also in other lines if you have such a dragon pawn structure. And the defense starts with the move pawn to e6. And after pawn to e6, it is not a big deal for white to change up queens, and the rook is developed from black. So I think the most aggressive move for white is to play bishop to g5. And the most of the players will be thinking, oh, I have to play queen to b6. But queen to b6 is a little bit too slowly. I think it is better and more directly to play f6 immediately. And after e takes f6 and knight takes f6, this is really solid position for black, because this knight is defended twice and it can only attack twice by bishop and by a queen. And so you can really quiet develop your pieces and going for an active game. And I will show you, for example, how this goes. And for example, knight to c3, you play d5 immediately, then rook to d1, then bishop to d7, then rook to e1, and queen to a5. And after these few moves, I think black's position is really solid. You have a good counterattack, you can go for some threats here. It is really solid, I would say. And I like black's position here. And that's the reason why I will talk not more about this position here, because I think this is quite solid. Now we come to sideline number 2. And this is a kind of Alapin attack from white. And if you don't know how to play correctly against this setup, I think you can go for some huge problems. And now I will show you how this goes. It starts with pawn to e4, c5, knight to f3, g6, playing hyper-accelerated dragon. And then here comes the bishop to c4, bishop to g7, and then g3. And after these few moves, you should know that the d5 square is the most important square in this opening. Don't losing space or some advantages here. And the only move to increase the d5 square is to play e6 immediately. And after pawn to d4, c takes d4, c takes d4, then you can push the d5. And after e takes, you have really solid game with black. And for example, I show you only a few moves, but this is the most important you have to remember. For example, bishop goes for some checks, and you are defending with the bishop. And for example, if bishop takes, I would prefer to take with the queen, because knight can later on go to his natural c6 square. And for example, your opponent is not goes not for a castle on the king side. For example, knight to e5 attacking the queen, queen to d6, and bishop to f4. And then here comes a tricky move. You can remember, if your opponent don't castles on the king side, you have to block this with queen to a6. You cannot castle on the king side. And now you have a really calmed game with black here, because after knight to c3, you can simply play, for example, knight to e7, castle on the king side, develop your pieces very natural, and your opponent has to retreat this knight to go for a castling. And I would say black is a little bit better in this position, but it is about equal. And I think this is the only things you should know about this opening. And if you know this, you will go for some comfortable games. Now we come for sideline number 3. And this is also kind of Alapin attack, but a little bit more different like the other one. And now I will show you that. And it starts with pawn to e4, c5, and knight to f3, g6. And now here comes the move pawn to c3. Then we'll play bishop g7, And then if you place the best move here, d4, you can capture d4, capture back, and now playing d5. Also d5. The d5 square is really, really important. And in this position, white has two options. At first sight, he can capture. This is the exchange variation. And on the other side, he can push this pawn to e5 and go for some space advantages. But both of them you can handle really good with black. And at first one, I will show you the exchange variation. If e captures d5, I think it is not good to capture now with the queen, because after queen captures d5, you can play knight to c3 with some tempo. So I will show you a better move now, and this is knight to f6. Because this pawn so and so cannot be protected anyways. And for example, now bishop to b5 check. You can defend with the bishop, and bishop takes, for example, though losing some tempis. And then you take with the knight. And for example, here comes this tricky move, pawn to d6, but then you can just castle on the king's side, and it's not good for white to take this pawn now, so he castles on the king's side too, and then you can capture this pawn. And I would say in this position this is about equal. For example, after queen b3 you could manage this with queen to b6, and this is about equal here. And you have managed this exchange variation. Now let's see what can happen after the move pawn to e5. This is a really popular line which is played by a few grandmasters. But after this, I will recommend bishop to g4 immediately, because this is the bad bishop in black's camp, and you should not be worried to change this bishop. And after the natural moves, bishop to e2, pawn to e6, and then knight to c3, knight to c6, castle on the king's side, knight to e7. I would say about 90% of your opponents in such positions will like to play bishop to g5 to pin this knight on e7. But here you can set a little trap after castling, queen to d2. And here we have a target now, and this is the d4 pawn. And you can win this with a little trap. And this trap starts with the move pawn to h6. And I would say that most of your opponent will simply grab this pawn. But after bishop takes h6, we have a following sequence. Bishop takes h6, queen takes on h6, and then we have this attacking move. Knight to f5, attacking queen. Queen has to retreat. But then we just remove one defender of d4 pawn. Bishop takes and knight takes on d4. And if we ask the computers, black is doing much better here, because we have the centralizing pawn. This pawn is isolated. I would say black is better here, and you can go for a very comfortable game. Let's go for sideline number 4. That's the sideline which I call knight takes c6 line. And here I will show how this goes. We're starting with pawn to e4, c5, knight to f3, g6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop on g7, bishop on e3 defending, and then knight to c6 and knight to c3. And after knight to f6, we reached standard position in the Yugoslav attack. And for example, white tries a move like f3 or bishop to c4. There will be the standard moves I will explain you in another video from me against the Yugoslav setup. But now I will show you a sideline, and this starts with knight captures on c6. You have to forcefully capture with the b pawn, and now white has the option to push e5. And very important, you have to remember in the hyper-accelerated dragon, if this will happen, it is always good to retreat the knight to his starting square to g8. And you have to remember the knight has to develop on the square h6 very soon. And I think then you have a really comfortable and good game. This is the most important thing you have to know in such confused openings. Okay, and now I will show you only a few natural moves and perhaps how you can continue in such a game. Okay, for example, white tries to defend the e-pawn because it is attacked by the bishop. And then that's what I'm saying, you have to play knight on h6. And then I play another natural move, for example, queen to f3. And then we have castle on the king side. And for example, white tries castle on the queen side. I think it is very often in the hyper-accelerated dragon that this is a good move to play now, this opening move pawn to d5. You can open up the position when white castles on the queen side. You have this open b file to go for some attacks. So now it is difficult for white to play against this because he cannot take with en passant. For example, he does do this. You have this simple threat bishop to g4 and you're just in exchange up, and this will be really bad here in this position for white. So that is not possible to take the pawn on d5, and for example he plays a comfortable move like pawn to h3. And after pawn to h3 you can break up this small center from white and go for a very strong attack here. And that's the reason why I like the move pawn to f6, because after e takes f6 and bishop takes f6, it is not really easy to see this immediately because you can simply capture the knight and go with the queen to a5 and keep some pressure on the king. For example, your opponent does not see this and plays a move like bishop to e2. You can simply capture the knight, and after b captures on c3, you can play queen to a5 and attack this pawn on c3. Okay, for example, bishop tries to defend this pawn, and you can bring out now your knight into the game and attacking this bishop. Your opponent cannot allow this and has to play bishop to e5. But after bishop to e5, you can simply give this check. The king has forcefully go to the square d2. And if we look now at this position, I would say black is doing much better, because he has this destroyed pawn structure on the queen side. The king is in the middle of the board or on the middle of the lines from white side. And I think that will be not really funny to play as white here. He has to fight very much. And at least I will show you just a few moves how you can go for your big advantage here. And this starts with the move knight to d6. And he has to forcefully take this knight, and after queen takes on d6. And now I play a standard move, pawn to b3. And then you have few continuations, for example bishop on f5 and later on e4. This will be really strong. And another variation is to play e5 immediately. And I think both of them are really crushing and really hard to defend for white. And I think I don't have to tell you more about this strong position. I would say this is quite better for black. Okay, this was the video about the sidelines in the hyper-accelerated dragon. I hope you liked this, got some new ideas, and perhaps you can give me a like on this. Thank you, bye bye.